So the two sole concessions that God makes for divorce in the Bible are adultery and abandonment. And outside of adultery and abandonment, divorce leads to adultery in remarriage. To quote David Platt, who's smarter than me, from the Christ-Centered Exposition Commentary on Matthew 19, he says remarriage is biblically permissible only for the offended spouse after a biblical divorce. Practically speaking, the non-adulterous spouse in the first exemption of adultery and the Christian spouse in the second exemption of abandonment can remarry according to these passages. Outside of these parameters, if a man or woman divorces his or her spouse, then he or she is not free to remarry, widows and widowers being the only exceptions. Such remarriage would be adulterous. I would include, I think, that act alone is adulterous, but the rest of that marriage wouldn't be adulterous, and I'll explain why later. High standard for divorce and remarriage, I know. And I also know that this is not a popular teaching, even amongst Christians. But this is what the Word says. But if we can just look maybe behind the law for a second and understand God's heart, then we would understand why it seems so rigid. If there were more concessions that God would make for divorce and more permissions for remarriage, wouldn't we take them? As evil men and as evil women, we would take them. And we would abuse them. And we would do it eagerly. And we would twist any situation to fit them, and more marriages would end as a result, and more of God's children would be hurt. I've come to appreciate God's high standards for divorce and remarriage because it speaks to me about God's high value for marriage.